All right, so listen, we're here in Olympia, and obviously we are celebrating a great election where we elected Jay Inslee, Democrat governor, 32 years in a row of a Democratic governor, the longest record in the state of Washington. Thanks for all the folks in the room that made that happen. There were people that said we weren't going to win that, but we went out and got the job done. Our victory has been tainted a little bit by the defection of Rodney Tom and Tim Sheldon to the other side. You say that a little louder. All right, good. You know, it just it brings home sort of how precarious every state in America is. Really, you know, who would have thought that Michigan would have right to work? Obviously, we didn't expect what happened in Wisconsin, Indiana. The recent disgusting move by the Republicans to remake the Electoral College to reward them for their gerrymandering and allow them to steal the White House. These are truly shameless folks that we're dealing with. But this is more than just a Republican Party. This is really an assault by the right wing in America, the well-financed right wing. They have a lot of institutes, a lot of institutions, a lot of money. They're not stupid. And they've been going after state houses. The front group, the lead organization for their assault is ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council. And they are a real threat across the country. You know, we won the governor's race by about 3 points. What are we up 8 points in the House? Pardon my ignorance. 8 votes in the House, I think. Okay, and then and obviously we don't control the Senate any longer. So it can happen in Michigan. It can happen in Wisconsin. It can happen in Washington. Rodney Tom acts like he's just on a walk through the park, that this is not consequential, his move to give the Senate to the Republicans, but it's extremely serious because the right wing is organized and they've got Olympia in their targets. And that's why we're going to hear today about ALEC, and I'm pleased to bring Brendan Fischer. Thank you for being pressed into service. His boss, Lisa Graves, is very sick, and if you've had the flu recently, you know that you can't operate with it. So Brendan Fischer is joining us. He's general counselor with the Center for Media and Democracy, graduated with honors from the University of Wisconsin Law School. He's worked extensively on the ALEC Exposed project, documenting the ALEC agenda, items like voter suppression, prison privatization, union busting, and NRA gun bills. And he is here to tell us about ALEC, and then we will have Brendan Williams will talk about Rodney Tom, and then we have a distinguished panel. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dwight. So I'm general counsel with the Center for Media and Democracy. We're a investigative reporting and government watchdog group based in Madison, Wisconsin, and we publish prwatch.org, sourcewatch.org, and then our latest project is alecexposed.org, where we track the activities of ALEC. And ALEC, in short, has been a vehicle for right-wing special interests to advance their agenda through the states and exert significant influence over state law and policy, but without the public ever really knowing. So it's a closed-door ALEC meetings where state legislators sit down with global corporations like Koch Industries and special interest groups like the Heartland Institute or Washington's Evergreen Freedom Foundation to hand state legislators changes to our laws that further the right-wing agenda and directly benefit the corporate bottom line. So the main thrust of what ALEC does is generate model bills. This is template legislation that legislators bring back to their states and then introduce in their own names without giving any indication they were pre-drafted by these special interests and that they're part of a national effort to promote a right-wing agenda. So the attacks on public sector unions in Wisconsin and Ohio and Florida in 2011 that can all be traced back to ALEC. The wave of voter ID laws that have swept the country in recent years, ALEC. The push to privatize public education through voucher programs and charter schools, ALEC. The current effort to roll back state renewable energy standards or teach climate change denialism, also ALEC. So you kind of get the idea. And I think the most important way to think about ALEC is not so much as an independent or freestanding think tank, but instead as a conduit for the right-wing agenda and an opportunity for the right-wing movement to set priorities for state-based legislation. So the model bills at ALEC that are at ALEC's core are not really developed by ALEC itself, but for the most part are developed by special interest groups or corporations and then brought to ALEC. A bill is then adopted through the 9 ALEC task forces, which are broken down by subject area. So there's a tax and fiscal policy task force, an education task force, and so on. And then state legislators and these lobbyists for special interests are given an equal vote on whether to adopt ALEC model legislation. This means that the private sector and public sector are given equal standing in ALEC, and that the private sector members actually have veto power within ALEC. So they can kill a proposal even if the legislators want to approve it. And we know that this has happened. So ALEC presents itself as this public policy resource that is legislator-driven, but the facts really suggest otherwise. 98% of ALEC's funding comes from its private sector members. Legislators pay just $50 a year to join, but the corporations and think tanks that make up the private sector members pay up to $25,000 a year for membership, plus additional thousands to join ALEC task forces, and additional fees to sponsor ALEC meetings. So, for example, the chairman level sponsorship of an ALEC meeting costs $50,000. That's how much ExxonMobil paid to sponsor the 2011 ALEC meeting. The presidential level to sponsor an ALEC meeting is $100,000. BP and RJ Reynolds Tobacco both sponsored ALEC's 2011 meeting at this level. So ALEC claims to be a membership organization, but when legislators are paying $50 a year and ExxonMobil and Koch Industries are paying tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars a year to be part of this organization, I think it's pretty clear that, you know, who's calling the shots. Just follow the money in this situation. And we know that these corporations and that these special interest groups are spending this much money because they want something in return. And evidence really suggests that they're getting it. So ALEC has a really broad agenda, and many of their agenda items have slipped through unnoticed. But the big controversial attacks are really when you see the right-wing network kick into gear. And that's when you recognize how ALEC is part of this really well-developed right-wing infrastructure. So in Michigan, the right-to-work bill that was introduced in December was lifted verbatim from ALEC model legislation. We did a side-by-side between the ALEC bill, the ALEC model bill, and the right-to-work legislation introduced in Michigan, and it was basically lifted word for word, a copy-and-paste job. That bill was co-sponsored in the legislature by ALEC members, but then on top of that, for years prior to this, a right-wing think tank in Michigan called the Mackinac Center had been laying the groundwork for this anti-union attack. They've been publishing studies, they've been publishing position papers, they've been working with legislators to advance these ideas. The Mackinac Center is also an ALEC member and has brought anti-union model bills to ALEC. And then also in Michigan is the DeVos family. DeVos is one of the top funders of the Republican Party in Michigan. Betsy DeVos chaired the Republican Party. The DeVos family foundations are also funders of ALEC and other groups in the right-wing network. Then, when Right to Work was introduced in Michigan, the Tea Party AstroTurf groups like Americans for Prosperity and Freedom Works started to organize rallies, provide fake grassroots support for the Right to Work effort. These groups are also part of ALEC. They're also paying this money to attend these ALEC meetings. They're in these rooms with state legislators, setting the agenda for what kind of right-wing legislation is going to be coming down the pike in coming years. And as we saw in Michigan, this all worked relatively seamlessly, and I think took many of us by surprise. So the way that obviously the way we fight back is by recognizing what sort of a threat this organization poses and paying attention. So ALEC was actually founded in 1973 by a guy named Paul Weyrich. He was a legendary right-wing activist. He co-founded the Heritage Foundation that same year. This just shows that they've been laying the groundwork for these institutions, and it's really now coming to fruition. And I think ALEC's influence really broke through in 2011. And this is in part because of Citizens United. So this was the U.S. Supreme Court decision in 2010. Citizens United had opened the floodgates to corporate political spending. And the 2010 elections were the first elections where we saw super PACs and dark money groups, as well as the influence of this manufactured Tea Party movement. And as a result of this, as a result of Citizens United, Republicans gained new majorities in state houses across the country. They took the governor's mansions in many states. And then with these new majorities, the ALEC agenda was able to spread rapidly. And of course, the same foundations and corporations that fund ALEC, in many cases, were the same ones funding these super PACs and the same ones funding the Tea Party. So this is the Koch Foundation, or the Koch family foundations, the Bradley Foundation, the DeVos family foundations, and others. And this small group of elites have been building this right-wing infrastructure since the 70s, constructing and funding groups like ALEC, as well as a network of state-based think tanks like the Mackinac Center in Michigan or the Evergreen Freedom Foundation here in Washington. And Citizens United allowed these wealthy funders to then pour an unprecedented amounts of money into elections, and then you saw the stars really align. So this right-wing attack that we've seen in the past couple of years, they've been laying this groundwork for a long time, and it's not coincidence. It's definitely more than coincidence. So in Wisconsin, where we're based, Scott Walker took the governor's mansion in 2010, and he was an ALEC member as a legislator. So the top contributor to the Walker campaign was Koch Industries. Koch also contributed $1 million to the Republican Governors Association in 2010, which in turn spent $5 million on the Walker race. Then, after Walker was elected, he appointed an ALEC legislator as the head of the Public Services Commission. That legislator had previously led the ALEC Telecommunications Task Force. The head of the Department of Administration had been the ALEC State Chair for Wisconsin. Walker appointed as head of the Department of Health Services a guy who worked with the Heritage Foundation. The new Republican speakers in both the House and Senate were ALEC members and held leadership positions in the organization. Similar things happened in other states. These guys came up through ALEC. They were bred. They earned their political chop by working within this right-wing infrastructure. And then when the money was let loose by Citizens United, you saw them take control, and you've seen the union busting spread across the country. You've seen these voter ID bills, tort reform measures, and again, it was not a coincidence. On the federal level as well, you saw Republicans gain a majority in the House, and the two guys who took the leadership were also ALEC alumni. Both John Boehner and Eric Cantor came up through ALEC. They were ALEC members when they were state legislators. In the U.S. Senate, you saw the election of ALEC alumni like Marco Rubio. So we know that, and we also know that ALEC, even though it keeps its focus on the state, continues to lobby and influence their alumni members. So ALEC is best known for these model bills, but it's more than that. It's obviously part of this right-wing network, but the way that they get these legislators to introduce these model bills is really interesting. So legislators attend these ALEC meetings, they're handed special interest legislation, and then they sit down in workshops and discussions where they're basically handed talking points, and then they bring the bills back and introduce them in their state in their own name. But the corporations that are members of ALEC and pushing this legislation are, of course, major political funders. So Koch Industries is a big funder of ALEC. Its chief lobbyist, Mike Morgan, is on the ALEC corporate board. And the Kochs and Koch Industries, of course, spend millions on political campaigns, both through direct contributions and in donations to the political advocacy groups that run ads. So legislators clearly have a strong incentive to advance the ALEC agenda because it can mean help from these same corporations in their campaigns. And then also for legislators, the deal is really sweetened by ALEC's private sector members paying for all of their flights and hotel rooms to these ALEC meetings. So these meetings kind of resemble a vacation. The ALEC meetings are kind of a fun place to go. They're held in places like New Orleans or Amelia Island, Florida. They're usually at the nicest hotels in town. After hours, the legislators get taken out for meals and drinks. They're invited to open bar parties, to exclusive party boxes at Major League Baseball games. So it's really an all-expenses-paid trip for legislators. And in many cases, in most states, legislators don't make a lot of money. I think the average legislative salary is around $45,000 a year. So these are trips that would be otherwise out of reach for our elected officials. And additionally, their legislators are encouraged to bring their families on the trips. Their corporate interests or the private sector members of ALEC pay for their travel expenses too. So this is obviously a lot of fun for legislators. You can see why they would want to go to an ALEC meeting, why they would want to go on an all-expenses-paid trip, but it obviously creates an environment for improper influence. And there's also a preference given for funding the travel expenses of those legislators who introduce model legislation. So basically, in exchange for introducing ALEC bills, for pushing the ALEC agenda, you're getting a free trip out of it. And if this sounds like bribery, I think you're probably right. And almost every state has ethics and lobbying laws on the books that prohibit legislators from accepting these types of gifts. So you'd think that accepting thousands of dollars of flights and hotel rooms and meals would be a clear violation of these laws, but ALEC has allowed legislators to sidestep these ethics and lobbying laws by calling the gifts a scholarship. So instead of calling it an all-expenses-paid trip designed to buy influence, they call it a scholarship. There seems to be no scholarly work done at these ALEC meetings. The legislators oftentimes are basically a captive audience. They're not bringing a whole lot to the meeting. What they're there to do is learn what they should be doing on behalf of this sort of right-wing agenda, or on behalf of this right-wing network. So the way that they've gotten around this is instead of having the private sector members hand a check to the legislator for the travel expenses, they filter the money through a segregated bank account held by ALEC. So it's really a scam. It's like a shell game. And Minnesota so far has been the only state whose ethics board has recognized that these so-called scholarships violate the state's good government laws. In Wisconsin, we filed complaints, but our board has not yet ruled on the matter. So stepping back a little bit, ALEC's influence was first recognized in 2011, but I mentioned that it was founded in 1973 by this guy, Paul Weyrich, who was a major social conservative. He would go on to found the Moral Majority with Jerry Falwell, which was one of the key groups in the religious right throughout the 80s. But ALEC has largely stayed away from the social issues. So I've heard the Reagan Coalition described as a three-legged stool. So one would be it's a coalition of the religious right. Two is sort of the anti-tax, anti-government wing. That's sort of exemplified now by Grover Norquist. And then three would be the war hawks. And ALEC has really propped up the economic anti-government leg of that stool, and they've done it through the states. And ALEC really started to gain influence in the 1980s with Reagan in the White House. And they started pushing policy that sounded kind of crazy at the time, like privatizing public education through voucher programs. So in the 1980s, this was not something that anyone had really talked about very much. ALEC started publishing these position papers, and of course, this education reform movement has now become mainstream, and this is largely the result of these ideologues working through ALEC. So you probably know what these voucher programs are. It's where students use taxpayer dollars to attend a largely unregulated private school, usually which is non-union, and then the funding for the public school is reduced proportionally. So this is kind of a starve the beast approach to dismantling public education. And keep in mind, in 1980, when Charles Koch ran for president on the Libertarian ticket, part of his platform was the abolition of public schools. So these ideas have gained momentum in recent years. So, but in addition to the ideological reasons for privatizing schools, there's also a lot of money to be made from this education reform effort. So until recently, the chair of the ALEC Education Task Force was a corporation called Connections Academy. So this is an online private education company that makes its money by way of these taxpayer-funded vouchers. They rake in around $1 billion in profits each year, but without actually showing any good educational outcomes. Also on the ALEC task force, the ALEC Education Task Force, was K-12 Inc., another online school provider that makes its money through this virtual education. So both of these companies obviously have a financial stake in advancing the education reform movement, and ALEC has been key in pushing vouchers, virtual public schools, special needs scholarships, these parent trigger laws, and the like. And vouchers were first implemented, ALEC really saw its first success with these vouchers in Wisconsin, where I'm from, in the early 1990s. And the idea, of course, came from ALEC. Our governor at the time was Tommy Thompson, who was involved with ALEC during his time as a state legislator, and then remained involved with the organization after becoming governor. And he was honored by ALEC for pushing this legislation, and he spoke at an ALEC meeting in 2002, and he said something really revealing. He said, I'm paraphrasing his quote, but it was basically, I used to love coming to these ALEC meetings as a legislator because I would come back with these ideas, dust them off a little bit, and then pass them off as my own. And this is a pretty good description about how ALEC works. It's a way for the right wing to set an agenda, hand off legislation to compliant state legislators, and advance uniform right-wing policies across the country, but without the public ever really knowing. The reason that they could do this, the reason that they could operate in such secret, is because their model bills were secret. They were on their website but behind a password-protected paywall. The ALEC meetings were closed to the press and also to the public, so you could never really connect the dots and recognize the extent to which our elected officials are doing the bidding of these out-of-state ideological interests and how they're part of this really national right-wing agenda. And this changed in 2011 when a whistleblower came to the Center for Media and Democracy with nearly 900 of these previously secret model bills. So we marked them up, we analyzed them, published them on our website, alecexposed.org, and then did an expose along with The Nation magazine, and then began to track ALEC's influence. And then everything really broke loose in 2012 when an unarmed African-American high school student named Trayvon Martin was shot and killed by a much older and much heavier man named George Zimmerman. And police in Florida initially refused to arrest Zimmerman, citing this obscure law called Stand Your Ground, which was basically a license to kill. And Americans started looking at these Stand Your Ground laws and realized that identical versions had passed in 24 states, but without anyone noticing at the time. And of course, these laws spread by way of ALEC, and we documented how the NRA shepherded the bill, or helped draft the Stand Your Ground bill, shepherded it into law in Florida, brought it to ALEC just weeks later, where it was adopted as a model bill, and then spread across the country. And when I think when people heard about this, they were rightly shocked and outraged that these really dangerous laws have been pushed nationwide and passed by our elected officials by way of this unaccountable and unelected secret cabal of special interests. And so we worked with the civil rights group Color of Change to spearhead a campaign asking corporations to drop their ALEC membership, and we've had enormous success in the past year. No. So 43 global companies have dropped their ALEC membership in response to this public pressure. So these are global corporations like Coca-Cola, Walmart, Amazon. And basically, if corporations stop funding ALEC, ALEC has fewer resources to push bills that promote voter suppression and union busting and anti-environmental legislation. But perhaps more importantly, I think these departures help expose ALEC for what it really is. When a company like Coca-Cola was involved with ALEC, the organization had the appearance of legitimacy. It helped disguise the fact that ALEC is really a highly partisan and highly ideological organization designed to advance this right-wing agenda. So I think companies like Coke may have been involved with ALEC for a very narrow reason, to access legislators, to push bills that were specific to their business interests, and they may not have concerned themselves with the other kind of insane legislation coming out of ALEC. And this was not really an issue because ALEC had been so secretive, because they've been able to operate behind closed doors without the public ever knowing, and they never had to face any sort of public accountability for their involvement. But now that the public is paying attention and the public knows what ALEC really is, Coke no longer wants their brand publicly associated with this group that pushes climate change denial or voter suppression or these crazy Stand Your Ground laws. So on the legislative level, in the past year, 70-some legislators have publicly dropped their ALEC membership as well, which is also a huge success. Yeah, and including some here in Washington, I think thanks to the work of Fuse Washington. The So we are, so my organization is a 501c3, so we're nonpartisan. We don't get involved in political campaigns, but I have heard in many cases in the 2012 elections, an ALEC legislators' membership did become a campaign issue. I think people across the political spectrum want to feel like their elected officials are working on behalf of their interests. They're looking out for their constituents rather than that their elected officials are a vessel to advance this national ideological agenda. So I think people, almost regardless of party, really don't want their legislators to be part of an organization like ALEC. And I think correctly, for many people, ALEC membership is synonymous with carrying the water for these ideological right-wing interests. So I just have a few other points. I think I should explain that ALEC is organized as a charity, like the Humane Society. So as a charity, it's supposed to be advancing some sort of charitable interests. You'd think that advancing the right-wing ideological agenda is not really a charitable interest, and that's about right. But additionally, as a charity, ALEC is supposed to be doing almost no lobbying. And the creation and promotion of this model legislation would be almost the definition of lobbying. Despite this, ALEC has told the IRS for years that it's done zero lobbying. So it's been the subject of a few IRS complaints in the past year by Common Cause and former IRS Director Marcus Owens. And these are really strong complaints. We're hoping the IRS will act on it soon. But the real reason I think that ALEC's charitable status is important is because it means that the corporations and special interests paying tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars for their ALEC membership dues and sponsorship fees, these are a charitable tax write-off. So they're getting tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars in tax write-offs for accessing legislators, pushing this ideological agenda. And these are funds that should be getting paid into public coffers to pay for schools and roads and police officers. So we as taxpayers are basically subsidizing this special interest lobbying. So we're really hoping that the IRS is going to be acting on this soon. So ALEC may have had less influence here in Washington because this is a blue state, but Washington has certainly had influence in ALEC. So the Evergreen Freedom Foundation, which I think many of you have heard of, is an ALEC member. Its founder, Bob Williams, has been involved with ALEC for a long time. In 2011, Bob Williams received the Private Sector Member of the Year award. He is on the Tax and Fiscal Policy Task Force. He's also on the ALEC Board of Scholars, and he sits on that Board of Scholars with people like Stephen Moore of the Wall Street Journal, who's on the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal. And both Williams and other people from the Evergreen Freedom Foundation have helped with the ALEC State Budget Reform Toolkit, which is an ALEC publication where they push right-wing tax policy and advance an ideological right-wing approach to budget development. So, for example, the current proposal here in Washington to impose a supermajority requirement on tax increases in the legislature is something being promoted through ALEC, but supported by Bob Williams and the Evergreen Freedom Foundation. And then his more recent group, the State Budget Policy Solutions. So the way ALEC defends itself is by making this claim that legislators should hear from the private sector, that the regulators should seek input from those that they seek to regulate. And I think most people would agree with this sort of basic premise. So business interests and private interests should be able to make their views known to legislators, and elected officials should seek input from the private sector when drafting policy. But the big business and ideological interests that are part of ALEC, they're already making their views known to legislators. That's why they hire lobbyists. That's why they make campaign contributions, and so on. So what ALEC does is take this influence peddling to another level. It pushes the public out of the door, and it almost creates this shadow government where laws and public policy priorities are determined by this small cadre of elite interests, and average citizens can have nowhere near the same level of influence or access, and we shouldn't stand for it. So that's all, and I think we have time for a few questions, or we... Sometimes it is difficult because there's over 900 models. So you can email us and contact us if you have a few questions about specific bills. Because we've looked at them all, sometimes it just rings it will sometimes ring a bell if you want to ask us about it. And thanks for showing the film. That was something I forgot to mention. Bill Moyers did a documentary on ALEC and our work and the work with other groups on the organization. It's called the United States of ALEC. There's now a website up. I think you can stream it online, but I know that there's also screenings that are happening around the country and probably here in Washington as well. Yeah.
Very good.
Just a couple. Oh, okay. I really don't need this. I have a big mouth. Just a couple of quick questions. How do we here in Washington? This is new to me. So how do we here in Washington bring light to and bring down ALEC? And then also, what major corporations are still involved, so we can boycott them?
Do you have a list of Washington legislators that are involved in ALEC, or is that something we need to research more?
Yeah, I do. Oh, okay. Yeah, we've got a list up on our website. So if you go to alecexposed.org, there's a link to ALEC politicians, and then you click on Washington, and you can find a list there. It's the information is not publicly available. They do not release their membership lists, but we've been able to gather a number of the members through research. So it may not be comprehensive, but it's a pretty solid list, and it's pretty close. So as far as exposing ALEC here in Washington, I mean, one thing you can do is ask your legislator if they are an ALEC member. Express your displeasure if not. Of course, talk to your family and friends. Maybe try and organize a screening of the United States of ALEC movie. I think that makes a pretty compelling case for why ALEC is a bad thing. And then as far as the remaining corporations, so there's some that I think are probably never going to leave. Koch Industries, I think, is going to be with ALEC to the end. They don't really care what the public thinks. Same with the tobacco industry. State Farm and AT&T have both remained with ALEC despite public pressure, and we continue to urge them to leave ALEC. So those are two groups that we can continue to try and put pressure on.
Dan?
Is there a strong connection between Tom Iman and ALEC? And if so, how do we shine a spotlight on that the next go around?
Yeah, I'm gonna wager guess there's not. Tim Iman is our right-wing initiative guru. He makes money by running initiatives, and what is that term? Jetsam, flotsam. What is it? Flotsam and jetsam. That's derogatory, right? Iman is the flotsam and jetsam of the right wing in Washington State, but probably not smart enough to have a relationship to ALEC. All right, let's do one more here. Martha Kessler.
Yes, I was surprised that you didn't mention that we do have an equivalent organization on our side, the Progressive States Network, which is, as you might expect, underfunded, but they have a website, and in fact, Karen Kaiser has done a lot of work in the healthcare sector for that group.
Yeah. So Progressive States Network does do a certain amount of model legislation, and they do try and bring legislators together. But it's my understanding that it's not creating that same sort of environment of undue influence over legislators. I think that is acting more like an actual public policy resource, which is a good thing. There's also the development of, it's called ALEC, and it's an acronym that I can't remember, but they're trying to be sort of a progressive counterweight to ALEC, but be completely transparent about it. Try and act as a good government resource instead of acting as a conduit for special interests and ideological interests to push this agenda. But yeah, that's right. That is a group that's on the left that's somewhat similar, but I don't think has the same bad qualities that ALEC does.
All right, big round of applause for Brendan Fischer. Brendan is going to be going over at lunch to meet with some of our Democratic senators to talk about ALEC, but we'll be around this afternoon at the craft feed, and this is his first visit to the Northwest, and if you have a chance to ask appreciate it. Excellent presentation.
Sure. Thanks for having me.
We're now going to bring up the other Brendan, the next Brendan on our list. Brendan Williams, a tremendously shy former legislator. If you're really warm and encouraging, you'll bring him out of his shell. Brendan is going to answer the question, who is Rodney Tom?